I know what it feels like to hold someone else's world in your two hands and never once think about putting it down. My granddaughter was 4 years old the morning her father left her on my porch. My grandson had just turned 2. He was still in a diaper. There was a bag between them, one bag, for 2 children, and inside it were 3 diapers, a half-empty container of formula, and a yellow stuffed rabbit with one eye missing. That was it. That was everything my son thought his children were worth. I remember standing at the screen door and watching the taillights of his truck disappear down the end of Crestwood Road, and I remember thinking he would call by morning. He would call by morning, feel ashamed, and turn around. I went inside and made the children toast. My granddaughter didn't cry. She sat at the kitchen table with her little hands folded in her lap and watched me work the toaster like she had been trained not to make trouble. That was the part that broke me. Not my son's truck, not the one-eyed rabbit. It was a 4-year-old girl who already knew how to disappear inside herself so she wouldn't be a burden. My son did not call by morning. He didn't call the morning after that, either. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a building contractor in Western Kentucky. I know how to fix things. I know how to look at something broken and figure out what it needs. But I had never raised small children on my own. My wife passed from cancer 11 years before any of this happened, and my son, my only child, had been drifting since his early 20s. Bad decisions, bad company, gambling debts that seemed to grow back every time I cut them down. His children's mother walked out when my grandson was still an infant. She signed away her parental rights and moved to another state. The court documents are still in my filing cabinet, behind the utility bills. So there I was, 61 years old, retired, living alone on 4 acres outside of Harlan. And suddenly, I had 2 children eating breakfast at my table every morning. I called a lawyer the first week, filed for emergency guardianship. The courts granted it without much difficulty, because there was no one to contest it. My son had not registered an address anywhere. His phone number had been disconnected. The caseworker who visited the house was a young woman named Sandra, and she walked through every room with a clipboard and asked my granddaughter gentle questions while I stood in the hallway with my hands in my pockets. Afterward, Sandra told me the children were healthy and that the home was suitable. She said I was doing the right thing. She shook my hand. I never saw her again, but I thought about her sometimes. I thought about how thin that thread was, one caseworker, one visit, one handshake, and how much I was asking it to hold. The years went by the way years do when you are too busy to count them. My granddaughter grew into a person who argued about everything and read every book she could get her hands on. She joined the debate team at Harlan County High School. She won a regional competition her sophomore year and came home with a trophy almost as tall as she was, and she put it on the mantel and said, "I told you I'd win." And I said, "You did tell me that." My grandson was quieter, more like me. He learned to work with wood in the shop behind the house. By the time he was 12, he could build a cabinet from scratch. He had his grandfather's patience and his grandmother's eyes, and sometimes when the evening light came through the kitchen window in a certain way, I had to look somewhere else. I did not hear from my son for 12 years. Then one Thursday in March, a black SUV pulled into my driveway and 2 men in suits got out. I was on the porch when they came up the steps. One of them was my son. I had not seen him in 12 years. He was heavier now, with a trimmed beard and the careful, pressed look of someone who had recently acquired money. The other man introduced himself as an attorney. He had a briefcase and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My son did not hug me. He did not look at the house or the yard. The attorney handed me a document. He was polite about it, almost gentle the way you are when you are about to do something that cannot be undone. He said that my son was petitioning for full custody of both of his minor children, citing what he called an unlawful and undocumented private arrangement in which I had allegedly withheld the children from their legal father for more than a decade. I read the words on the paper. Then I read them again. "You want to take them?" I said. My son finally looked at me. "They're my kids," he said. "I have been in disputes before. Contractor disputes, property disputes, a boundary line argument with a neighbor that lasted 3 years and ended in magistrate court. I know how to stay calm, I know how to keep my voice level when what I actually want to do is something that would land me in jail. I kept my voice level. I said, "Come back tomorrow." The attorney started to say something about service of process and legal timelines, and I held the door open and looked at my son and said, "Tomorrow." And something in my face must have communicated that I was not going to negotiate on this point, because they got back in the black SUV and left. I sat on the porch for a long time. Then I went inside and knocked on my granddaughter's door. She was 17 now, almost 18 tall, serious, with her mother's mouth and her grandmother's stubbornness. She was at her desk doing homework when I came in. I handed her the document. I sat on the edge of her bed while she read it, and I watched her face change. She read slowly. She is thorough in everything she does. When she finished, she set the papers on her desk and turned her chair around to face me. "He wants us back," she said. "That's what the papers say." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why now?" I told her I didn't know for certain, but that I had a suspicion. The previous fall, I had been diagnosed with a heart condition. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough that I had updated my will. My property, 4 acres, the house, the shop, and a modest retirement account was left to my 2 grandchildren in equal parts. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. And my son had apparently learned about the update. I don't know how. People talk. My granddaughter looked at me for a long time without speaking. "He's not getting us," she said. "I know. I mean it. He is not getting us." "I know that too," I said. "But I need you to let me handle this the right way." The right way turned out to be more complicated than I had planned. My attorney, a good woman named Beverly, who had handled my wife's estate years before, reviewed the guardianship paperwork and told me that while I was on solid legal ground, the situation was not simple. My son was the biological father. My guardianship had been granted in an emergency context 12 years ago, and while it had never been formally challenged, my son could argue that circumstances had changed. He was employed now. He had a residence. He had stayed clean, apparently, for several years. Beverly told me that the court would want to hear from the children, which was good, but that a judge would also weigh the biological parents' rights seriously. She also told me there was one thing that would end the case before it began. "If you have any documentation," she said, "anything showing that he voluntarily and knowingly left those children in your care, a letter, a recording, a written statement, anything that changes everything, that becomes abandonment, not custody dispute." I went home that night and started going through boxes. My neighbor Earl came over while I was in the middle of it. Earl is 72 and has lived in the house at the end of my road for longer than I have. He is the kind of man who shows up without being asked. He had watched my grandchildren grow up from across that road. He had driven my granddaughter to debate tournaments when I had a back injury that kept me from driving. He had taught my grandson to fish. He came into the living room and saw boxes spread across the floor and the expression on my face. I told him what Beverly had said. I told him I was looking for anything my son might have left behind, any record of that night 12 years ago. Earl sat down on the couch and rubbed his jaw. "The old phone?" he said. I looked at him. "You remember," he said. "That first week after they showed up. You found some kind of old phone in the bag with the kids' things. You couldn't figure out whose it was. You charged it up and you put it in the box with the guardianship papers because you didn't know what else to do with it." I stood up. I went to the filing cabinet. The phone was in a Ziploc bag taped to the inside of the folder. It was a model that was already several years outdated when I'd found it. The battery was dead, of course, but I found a compatible charger at the electronics store in town the next morning. And when I plugged it in and turned it on that afternoon, it still worked. There were 47 text messages and 3 voicemails. The third voicemail was from my son, recorded the day he dropped off the children. I sat at the kitchen table and played it twice without moving. His voice was unmistakable, even 12 years younger. He was not crying, but he sounded thin and exhausted in the way people sound when they have been making bad decisions for too long and they know it. He said he needed me to take care of them for a while. He said he owed money to people he couldn't pay, and that it wasn't safe for the kids to be around. He said, "Dad, I'm leaving them with you. because I can't take care of them right now. Please don't call the police. I'll figure things out and come back when I can." He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." He had said it twice. I had needed to hear it for 12 years. And hearing it now in this context, as evidence in a legal dispute over children he had abandoned, made it feel like something that had gone rotten in the jar. I called Beverly. She went quiet for a moment after I told her. And then she said, "Don't lose that phone." I didn't lose the phone. Earl drove me to Beverly's office that same afternoon, and she had it logged and documented with a timestamp analysis performed by a forensic service she worked with. The voicemail had metadata attached to it. The date and time of the recording were intact. Everything was intact. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in April. I had not slept well in the weeks leading up to it. I am not a man who shows his nerves on the surface. 30 years in contracting teaches you to look steady when the ground is uncertain. But I was not sleeping. I would get up at 2 in the morning and sit in the kitchen and drink coffee and watch the dark in the window and think about the worst possible outcomes. I had been thinking about worst-case outcomes my entire adult life, and it had never stopped me from doing the work in front of me. But it also had never stopped the thinking. The morning of the hearing, my granddaughter came into the kitchen before 6. She was already dressed. She sat across from me at the table and poured herself coffee, which she had started drinking a year ago, which I still wasn't used to. "How do I look?" she said. "Like someone who's about to win an argument," I said. She smiled at that, just briefly. I want to say something about that moment, because I don't know how to say it except directly. Sitting across from my granddaughter in the early morning kitchen light, watching her wrap both hands around her coffee cup, the way her grandmother used to do, I understood that whatever happened in that courtroom, I had not wasted these 12 years. I had not missed anything. I had been exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. And no judge, and no attorney, and no biological claim on paper could change what had actually happened in this house between these people. I knew that. I held on to it. My grandson was quieter that morning. He had his good shirt on, and his jaw set in the way he does when he is working through something internal. He hugged me before we got in Earl's truck. He is not a hugger, usually, which is also like me, and he held on for a moment longer than usual. I patted his back and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would improve on what he'd just done. Earl drove. I sat in the front. My grandchildren sat in the back. Nobody talked much on the way into town. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. These things always are. In county seats, not the grand architecture of television dramas, just a low-ceilinged room with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs along the wall. My son was already seated when we came in. He didn't look at us. His attorney was arranging papers with the particular efficiency of someone who charges by the hour. Beverly was calm. Beverly is always calm. She had told me beforehand that the voicemail would be introduced during her argument, and that she had also filed documentation from my granddaughter's school, 4 years of records, teacher notes, attendance history, the debate trophy, and from the family physician who had been seeing both children since the year after they arrived. Records that showed 2 children who were thriving, stable, and deeply embedded in a family and a community. Records that showed a grandfather who had been present for every appointment, every conference, every emergency. The judge was a man in his late 60s with reading glasses on a chain, and the deliberate manner of someone who has heard everything and is not easily surprised. My son's attorney went first. He presented his argument carefully. My son had reformed. My son had stable employment and housing. My son's parental rights had never been formally terminated. The children deserved the opportunity to know their biological father. The arrangement in place, while it had been appropriate for an emergency situation, had never been intended as permanent. He said that last part with confidence. Beverly let him finish. Then she stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A." She played the voicemail through a small speaker on the evidence table. The room was completely still while my son's voice came through. "I'm leaving them with you because I can't take care of them right now." The judge listened without expression. My son's attorney made a note on his legal pad and did not look up. 4, Lover 9. My son's attorney. My son's attorney. My son's attorney. My son's attorney. "I don't know when I'm coming back. I watched my son while it played. He was looking at the table. I do not know what was happening inside him, and I am no longer sure it matters. When it finished, the judge removed his reading glasses and set them on the bench. "Counselor," he said to my son's attorney, "how does your client respond to this recording?" There was a consultation. Quiet voices. I watched Beverly, who was watching the judge with the steady patience of someone who has already won and knows it. My son's attorney straightened and said that his client disputed the context in which the recording should be interpreted. The judge put his glasses back on and looked at the paper in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up. "I'm going to hear from the minor," he said. My granddaughter had turned 18 3 weeks prior, which meant she was no longer a minor in the eyes of the court. Beverly had flagged this in her preparation. My granddaughter was permitted to address the court not as a child subject to a custody determination, but as a legal adult with standing to speak on her own behalf, and on her brother's behalf, as his closest family member. She walked to the front of the courtroom and stood without fidgeting. She did not look at her father. She looked at the judge. "I want to address something," she said, "because I think it needs to be said out loud." The judge nodded. "I was 4 years old when my father left us with my grandfather," she said. "I remember that morning. I remember what I was wearing. I remember the bag he left between me and my brother. I remember watching his truck go down the road." She paused. "My grandfather has been at every school conference, every doctor's visit, every debate tournament. He taught my brother everything my brother knows about building things with his hands. He learned how to braid hair from a YouTube video because I asked him to, and he wanted to get it right." Her voice was even. She had the practiced steadiness of a competition debater and the deeper, harder steadiness of someone saying something real. "I am 18 years old. My brother is 14. We have a home. We have a grandfather who chose us every single day for 12 years. And I am standing here today because I want this court to know that whatever decision is made, I am not leaving that house, and I am not leaving that man. He is my family. He is the only parent either of us has ever had." She came back to her seat. My grandson reached over and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She covered it with hers for a moment, and then they both straightened and looked forward. The judge asked my son directly if he had anything to say. My son stood up slowly. For a moment I thought he might actually say something real, something that acknowledged what he had done, what he had left behind, what those children had needed that he had not provided. I watched his face and I saw the shape of it, the moment where a man can either reach for the truth or reach for the version of events that costs him less. He chose the easier version. He said he had made mistakes and that he wanted to make things right. The judge looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "In 12 years, you made no contact. You provided no financial support. You made no attempt to establish or maintain a parental relationship. You did not contest the emergency guardianship, and you have now presented this court with a custody petition in the same month that your father updated his estate documents." He set down his papers. "The court finds no grounds to alter the existing custodial arrangement. The petition is dismissed." He paused. "Furthermore," the judge said, "given the recorded statement, the documented history of absence, and the minor child's age and circumstances, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for a review of whether the abandonment constituted a criminal act under Kentucky statute." My son's attorney started to say something. The judge looked at him. He stopped saying it. Outside the courthouse, the April air was cold and clean. Earl had waited on a bench by the entrance, and he stood up when he saw us. He looked at my face, and then he looked at my granddaughter, and he nodded once, the way men of his generation acknowledge things that matter without making a production of them. My granddaughter hugged him. Earl is not a hugger either. He stood there with his arms slightly out from his sides, and then he hugged her back properly and patted her twice on the shoulder blade. My grandson shook his hand. Earl said, "Good day." My grandson said, "Yeah." We went to the diner on Main Street and ordered breakfast even though it was nearly noon. Earl ordered the same thing he always orders, which is eggs over easy with white toast and coffee. and he paid for everyone's meal before any of us could reach for our wallets. I thanked him. He said, "Don't mention it." I said I was going to mention it. He said, "Fine. You can mention it once." That evening, I sat on the porch by myself while the sun went down behind the ridge. My grandson came out and sat next to me for a while without talking, which is a thing we do that I have always valued. Eventually, he said, "You okay?" I said I was. He said, "Good." He went back inside. My granddaughter came out later. She had changed out of her court clothes into jeans and an old flannel shirt that had been mine once, years ago. And she folded herself into the other porch chair and pulled her knees up. We watched the last of the light go. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's usually dangerous," I said. She smiled. "I want to apply to law school." I looked at her. "After undergrad," she said. "I want to be a family law attorney." She paused. "There are a lot of kids who don't have someone like you. I want to be the Beverly for those kids. The one who knows what to look for." I didn't say anything for a moment. "That," I said finally, "is the best idea I've heard in years." She leaned over and put her head against my shoulder, the way she used to do when she was small. I put my arm around her. The porch light was on and the moths were coming to it, and somewhere down the road a dog was barking at something in the dark. I had not planned for any of this. I had not planned to spend my 60s raising 2 children, getting up at 6 in the morning for school runs, sitting through teacher conferences, learning to braid hair from a video on my phone. I had not planned to stand in a courtroom at 63 and fight for the right to keep my own family together. But I have spent enough years building things to know that the structures that hold are not always the ones we planned. Sometimes the most solid foundation is the one that got put together in a hurry, in a crisis, by someone who had no choice but to figure it out. You pour the concrete. You wait for it to set. You build on top of it year after year. And one day you look up and you realize you have built something that will stand long after you are gone. My son's case was reviewed by the DA's office. 2 months later, he was charged with child abandonment under Kentucky law. He entered a plea arrangement that included a fine and a period of supervised probation. I heard about it from Beverly, who called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in the shop helping my grandson fit a drawer into a cabinet he had been building for 3 weeks. I listened to her tell me the details. I said thank you. I put the phone in my pocket and picked up a plane and handed it to my grandson and said, "You need to take a little more off this edge here." He took the plane. He looked at me. He can read my face the same way his grandmother used to. "Good news?" he said. "Good news," I said. He turned back to the cabinet and ran the plane along the drawer edge, clean and smooth. Curls of pale wood fell to the floor. He fit the drawer in and pushed it, and it slid without catching. A perfect fit, nothing wobbling. "There it is," he said. "There it is," I said. Earl came over for dinner that Friday, like he does most Fridays. My granddaughter made her grandmother's recipe for chicken and dumplings, which she had asked me to teach her 3 years ago and which she now makes better than I do. We sat at the kitchen table, the 4 of us, and ate until we were full, and talked about nothing in particular, about my grandson's cabinet, about Earl's garden, about my granddaughter's college essay, about the weather coming in from the west. At some point, Earl raised his coffee cup and looked around the table without saying anything. We all understood what he meant. Some things don't need words. Some things just need people sitting together at a table, warm and fed, telling each other about the ordinary days, the good, small, unremarkable days that are, when you add them all up, the whole of everything that matters. I raised them. I fed them. I showed up for 12 years when no one else did, and I would do it again without hesitation. Every single morning, every single time.